Julian Voss built an empire on silence, judges who looked away, harbormen who lowered their voices, a city that smiled because it was afraid not to. But the night he humiliated his pregnant wife in front of Boston's elite, he didn't know he'd already lost her. By sunrise, her ring was on his pillow, a letter beside it, and 3 words underlined twice. I tried. Stay with me to the end of this story, hit like, and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Carrington Hotel ballroom smelled like money that had been laundered twice. Champagne, candle wax, and the particular cologne men wore when they wanted to be remembered as powerful instead of dangerous. Julian Voss stood near the bar with a glass he wasn't drinking, watching the room work the way he'd built it to work. Senators touched his shoulder like he was a relic in a museum they were allowed to admire. A judge named Holloway laughed too hard at something Julian hadn't said, just to be seen laughing near him. That was the currency in this city. Proximity. Julian had spent 15 years making sure his name did the talking so his hands never had to. Clara stood 8 feet away in a navy dress that didn't fit anymore the way it used to. One hand resting low on her stomach without thinking about it, the way pregnant women do when their body has started speaking a language only it understands. She was 6 months along. Anyone looking would have known it. Nobody in that ballroom was looking. They were looking at Julian. She caught his eye once across the room, and for a second something passed between them that looked almost like the early years. The ones before board meetings ran longer than dinners, before silence became his answer to everything. Then Marcus Rain appeared at Julian's elbow, said something about shipping manifests and a name Julian recognized as Trouble. And Julian's face did the thing it always did. It closed, like a door with a deadbolt sliding home. Clara crossed the room anyway. She had learned, in 9 years of marriage, that there was a window, small, narrow, when Julian could still be reached before the business swallowed him whole for the night. She caught his sleeve. Julian, I need 5 minutes. Just 5. Not now, Clara. It's not now. It's been 3 weeks of not now. Her voice stayed low, controlled, the practiced quiet of a woman who'd learned to fight in rooms full of people who weren't supposed to see her fighting. I need to talk to you about the baby. About me. Marcus Rain was still standing there, close enough to hear, smiling the way men like him smiled when they were collecting information instead of giving it. Julian felt the eyes of the room without looking at them. Holloway watching, 2 city councilmen watching, a reporter from the Globe who covered business stories that always seemed to skip the worst parts. Julian's jaw tightened. He didn't see his wife standing in front of him asking for help. He saw an audience. You want to do this here? His voice dropped. The warning register, the one that used to make grown men in his employ go quiet and look at their shoes. I want to do this anywhere, Julian. I've tried your office. I've tried breakfast. I've tried the car. You keep finding a door to walk through. Clara, I'm not well. The words came out cracked, the first time she'd said them out loud to him instead of to a doctor or to the ceiling at 3 in the morning when her heart felt like it was trying to climb out of her chest. Something is wrong. I need you to actually hear that. And Julian Voss, in front of 200 of the city's most powerful people, in front of a wife who had just handed him the rawest sentence of her life, said the thing that would end everything. You've always been too soft for the life I lead. He didn't say it cruelly. That was the worst part. He said it tired, dismissive, the way a man brushes lint off a jacket, like her fear was an inconvenience standing between him and the rest of his evening. The room went quiet for exactly 2 seconds, then filled itself back in with laughter, low and polite, the kind that exists specifically to paper over a wound nobody wants to look at directly. Holloway chuckled into his scotch. Someone murmured something about marriage with a knowing little smile. Clara didn't cry. She had cried plenty already, alone in the bathroom with the fan running so the staff wouldn't hear. She had nothing left to perform for this room. She looked at her husband for a long moment, long enough that Julian, even buried under his own arrogance, felt something shift, some cold draft moving through a house he'd thought was sealed. And then she turned and walked toward the doors. She didn't storm. She didn't slam anything. She just left, the way water leaves a cracked glass, quietly, completely, and impossible to put back. Julian told himself she'd cool off. He told himself that for the rest of the night, through 2 more conversations with men who wanted favors, through a phone call from his mother that he let go to voicemail, through the long black car ride home where he sat in the back seat scrolling through emails instead of calling his wife. Because calling meant admitting something had actually happened. He didn't understand yet. Some doors don't reopen because you're sorry. They reopen because someone decides, finally, to stop waiting for sorry. The penthouse was dark when he got home, the floor-to-ceiling windows showing him nothing but Boston Harbor glittering black and cold 30 floors down. He called her name once, out of habit, more than hope, and the apartment answered with the particular silence of a place that has already been left. He found it on his pillow, not on hers, on his. Her wedding ring, the platinum band catching the low light from the hallway, set with deliberate precision in the exact center of where his head would land. Beside it, a folded letter. Beside that, a sonogram photo. The grainy black and white outline of a small curled body, and beneath it, in Clara's handwriting, 3 words that would carry Julian Voss through every single night for the rest of his life. Our daughter. I tried. He read the letter standing up, because some part of him refused to sit down for this, refused to let his body accept it as something that required comfort. His hands weren't steady. He noticed that distantly, the way you notice your own symptoms during a fever. Interesting, foreign, happening to someone else. Clara's handwriting filled 4 pages, front and back, and every line was a small, precise incision. She told him about the diagnosis first. Peripartum cardiomyopathy, the doctor had called it. A heart weakening under the strain of carrying a child it wasn't strong enough to carry. She told him she'd been diagnosed 11 weeks ago. She told him she had tried to tell him at dinner on a Tuesday, and he'd taken a call from Hong Kong mid-sentence. She told him she had tried again on a Sunday morning, standing in his office doorway with the discharge papers from her cardiologist in her hand, and he had held up one finger, like she was a waiter interrupting a meeting, while he finished reading something on his phone. She told him she had tried a 3rd time, at breakfast, and he had kissed the top of her head and said, "Tonight, I promise," and then come home at 1 in the morning smelling like a stranger's cigar smoke and gone straight to his study. Every time she wrote, "You chose calls. You chose power. You chose silence." And I understood, somewhere around the 2nd time, that I was going to have to choose for both of us, because you'd stopped being capable of choosing me. The 4th page was the one that broke him. "Vivian," she wrote, "your mother has known for 6 weeks. I told her in confidence because I didn't know who else to turn to, and she told me, these were her exact words, Julian, that a Voss wife who shows weakness creates a Voss heir who is weak. She told me not to tell you. She said it would make you doubt yourself at a time when the family needed you strong. She buried it. Your own mother buried the fact that your wife and your daughter might die, because she was more afraid of you looking vulnerable than she was of me actually being in danger." Julian sat down then. The letter shook in his hands, and he read the last lines twice because the first time his eyes refused to process them. "I'm not punishing you, Julian. I'm protecting her. I don't know yet if I can protect myself from loving you, but I can protect our daughter from growing up in a house where her father chooses everything over her mother. I need to go somewhere you can't reach with money or men or threats. I need to be somewhere quiet enough to hear my own heartbeat again. Don't follow me looking for your wife. If you come looking for the man I married before all of this. He's the only one I'd let back in." The apartment held its silence around him while he sat there, the city lights below pulsing on like nothing in the world had just ended. Somewhere in the building, an elevator chimed. Somewhere outside, a ship's horn sounded long and low across the harbor, the kind of sound that always made Clara stop talking mid-sentence and listen, like it meant something to her that it never meant to him. He picked up his phone and called his mother. Vivian Voss answered on the 2nd ring, her voice smooth as poured glass, untouched by the hour. "Julian, it's nearly 2. Did you know?" His voice came out flat, dangerous, in a register she would have recognized from his father, though she'd never admit that. "Clara's heart. Did you know?" A pause. Not surprise. Calculation. Julian had built his entire empire reading the difference between those 2 silences, and he heard it now in his own mother. "I knew there were concerns," Vivian said carefully. "I didn't think it was my place." "She told you 11 weeks ago. She told you, and you told her to keep it from me. Julian, you were closing the Marlowe acquisition. You needed clarity, not what?" His voice cracked across the line like a whip. Not the truth that my wife and my child might die? That wasn't worth interrupting a deal for? I was protecting this family. You were protecting yourself. Julian stood up, paced toward the window, his reflection ghosted over the black water below. You've spent 30 years deciding what version of reality I'm allowed to know. You did it to Dad. You're doing it to me. And because of it, I said something to my wife tonight in front of 200 people that I am never going to be able to take back because I didn't know what she was carrying. I didn't know what she was fighting. I called her soft mother. I called the woman trying to survive long enough to give birth to my daughter soft because you decided I needed clarity. Julian, don't call me again until I call you. His thumb found the red circle on the screen, and he ended the call mid-syllable, his mother's voice cut off clean. The silence that followed somehow louder than anything she'd said. By morning, Julian had not slept. He had instead done the only thing he knew how to do with pain. He'd turned it into action, the cold, mechanical kind that had built his empire in the first place. He sat at the long table in his home office with 3 phones in front of him and made calls that would have terrified most men in his position to make. He called his head of security, Dario, and told him to freeze every shared account, every joint card, every system that connected him to Vivian Voss's movements through his businesses. Cut her out, Julian said. Every property, every entity with my name on it. She doesn't get a key, a code, or a car. Effective this morning. Sir, your mother holds a 30% stake in... I know what she holds, Dario. I built half of it for her, so she'd have a reason to stay loyal. That ends today. Send the paperwork to legal. I want it filed by noon. He called Reyes next, a man who had found things and people for Julian for nearly a decade. A man who didn't ask questions because the questions had stopped mattering to him a long time ago. Clara left last night, Julian said, and even saying it out loud made something in his chest fold inward. I need her location, not a team, not a car following her, just an address. I'm going alone. Boss, if something happened to her in your territory, people are going to ask, nothing happened to her except me, Julian said, and the honesty of it surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise Reyes, because Julian Voss did not talk like that, did not admit fault out loud to subordinates, did not crack the careful architecture of control he'd spent his whole adult life constructing. Find her, quietly, today. He hung up and sat with his hands flat on the table, breathing, trying to remember the last time he had been afraid of anything that money couldn't fix. Reyes called back at 4 in the afternoon. Clara had taken a bus, paid cash, switched routes twice in a way that looked deliberate, the way someone behaves when they've thought through exactly how not to be found by a man with Julian's resources. She'd ended up in a town called Haven Point, 4 hours north along the Maine coast, a place small enough that everyone in it would notice a stranger within an hour of his arrival. She was staying above a diner owned by a woman named Ruth Bell. The town's sheriff, a woman named Marin Cole, had already been seen walking Clara to a doctor's appointment, which meant Clara had told someone, which meant Clara had built herself a wall of people in less than 24 hours that Julian would have to walk through one human being at a time. Julian didn't bring guards. He didn't bring Dario. He didn't bring anything but a car, a duffel bag he packed without thinking about what was in it, and 4 hours of highway to sit with the specific, suffocating terror of a man who has always been the most powerful person in any room, driving toward a town where none of that would matter at all. Haven Point announced itself the way small coastal towns always did. A sign with peeling paint, a lighthouse visible before the buildings were, the smell of salt and diesel and frying fish drifting through the cracked car window. Julian parked outside a diner with a hand-painted sign reading Bells, the neon open buzzing faintly even though it was barely past noon. His hands were sweating on the wheel. He hadn't sweated from nerves since he was 19 years old, standing in his father's study being told what kind of man he was expected to become. He went inside. The bell over the door rang, cheap and tinny, and every head in the place turned toward him with the particular suspicion small towns reserve for men in expensive coats. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled back tight and forearms that suggested she'd spent decades carrying more weight than the diner required. And she looked at Julian the way you'd look at a storm cloud that had wandered too far inland. "Help you?" Ruth Bell's voice had no warmth in it at all. I'm looking for Clara Voss. The whole diner seemed to inhale at once. A man in a flannel jacket at the counter set down his coffee cup very slowly, like he was preparing to stand. Ruth didn't move. Don't know her, Ruth said. She's my wife. She's pregnant. I need to see her. Mister, I said I don't know her. Ruth's eyes hadn't blinked. And even if I did, a woman who runs 4 hours from a man doesn't generally want that man showing up asking for her by name in a town full of people who will remember his face. Julian felt something he hadn't felt in years. The particular helplessness of being in a room where his name meant nothing, where his money was worthless, where the only currency that mattered was trust, and he had none banked anywhere in this building. He thought about Rhea's intelligence, about pushing past Ruth, about the dozen ways he could find Clara's exact location within the hour if he simply stopped trying to be polite about it. Then he thought about the letter, about the words, "Don't come looking for your wife." My name is Julian Voss. He said it slowly, deliberately, like a man laying down a weapon on a table. I said something to her 3 nights ago that I shouldn't have said, in front of people who didn't deserve to hear it, and I didn't let myself know that she was sick, that our daughter might not make it. I'm not here to take her anywhere. I'm here because I need her to look at me and tell me to leave, if that's what she wants. I just need to hear it from her, not from a town full of strangers protecting her, even though I understand why they are. The diner stayed quiet. Outside, a gull screamed over the harbor. Ruth Bell studied Julian's face for a long moment, the kind of assessment that had nothing to do with his suit or his car, and everything to do with whatever she could see moving behind his eyes. Sit down, Ruth finally said. Booth in the back. Don't talk to anybody. I'll make a call. Julian sat. His hands, folded on the worn Formica table, would not stop trembling. 40 minutes later, the bell over the door rang again, and Sheriff Marin Cole walked in, tall, weathered, a woman who looked like she'd settled more disputes with her voice than her holster. She slid into the booth across from Julian without asking permission. You're the husband? Yes. You understand I could have you out of this town in under an hour if Clara wanted that. I understand. She doesn't want that. Not yet. She wants to see you. Marin leaned forward, her forearms on the table, her eyes flat and unreadable. But I want to be real clear about something before I take you to her. This town doesn't care who you are in Boston. I've heard things, Mr. Voss. Things about how you do business. Things about men who cross you and don't get to walk away clean. None of that exists here. You so much as raise your voice at that woman. You so much as make her feel small one more time, and I will make every legal and illegal problem you have ever caused look like a parking ticket compared to what happens to you in my county. We clear? Julian held her stare. There was a time, not long ago, when a threat like that, spoken to him by anyone in any town, would have triggered something cold and immediate in him, some reflex of power that didn't tolerate being spoken to that way. Instead, he felt something closer to relief. Someone, finally, was treating Clara like she mattered more than he did. We're clear, Julian said. Marin studied him another second, then nodded once and stood. Doctor's office, 2 streets over. She's getting checked. You can see her after. Dr. Elias Wren's office was a converted house at the edge of town, white clapboard, a hand-lettered shingle out front. Julian waited on the porch step because Marin told him to, and he sat there in his $3,000 coat on a wooden step that had been worn smooth by 40 years of fishermen's boots, watching the harbor fog roll in over rooftops. And for the first time since he was a teenager, Julian Voss did not know what to do with his hands. The door opened behind him 40 minutes later. He stood too fast, turned too fast, and there she was. Clara looked thinner in the face, but rounder everywhere else, her hand resting on the small of her back the way pregnant women do in the later months, exhaustion sitting under her eyes like bruises. She looked at him the way you look at weather, assessing whether it was going to be dangerous before deciding whether to stand in it. You found me, she said. Not a question. You didn't make it hard enough. His voice cracked on the attempt at gentleness. I'm sorry, Clara. I am so... Don't! She held up a hand and it stopped him cold, the way nothing in 15 years of business negotiations ever had. Don't do the apology here. Not on Dr. Wren's porch, not with Marin standing 20 feet away making sure you don't try anything. I don't have the strength for your apology right now, Julian. I have maybe 40 good minutes in me on a good day before my heart reminds me it's not built for stress, and I'm not spending them on guilt. Yours or mine? Julian nodded, swallowing hard. Okay, if you want to be near me, and I haven't decided yet if I want that, there are rules. Claire's voice didn't waver, even as her hand pressed harder against her lower back. No guards. Not one. If I see a single man I don't recognize within 100 yards of this town, you're gone, and I mean gone for good. No force of any kind, ever. Not moving me somewhere, not making medical decisions for me, not deciding anything about her. Her other hand went to her stomach. Without my say. No asking for forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. You don't get absolution just because you showed up. You get the chance to be useful. That's it. That's all I'm offering. I accept. You don't get to accept like it's a business deal, Julian. For the first time, something hot flashed behind her exhaustion. This isn't a contract you sign and then find the loopholes in over the next 6 weeks. This is the only structure I have left holding me together. You break it once, you don't get a second chance to learn the lesson. Julian stood on that porch, in a town where his name bought him nothing, in front of a woman who held the only leverage that had ever actually mattered to him, and he said the truest sentence of his entire adult life. I have spent 15 years being obeyed, Clara. I have never once obeyed anyone. I'm telling you, I'll obey you. Not because I'm trying to win you back tonight, because I finally understand that if I don't, I'm going to lose both of you, and there's no amount of money or fear in the world that fixes that kind of loss. Clara looked at him for a long, long moment, the fog thickening behind her, gulls crying somewhere over the water, and something in her face, not forgiveness, not yet, but the smallest crack of a door not fully closed, flickered and held. There's a room above Ruth's diner, she said finally. It's small. It smells like fryer grease. You're not staying in it with me. There's a motel 2 miles out on Route 1. You can stay there if you mean what you just said. I mean it. We'll see. She turned to go back inside, then stopped, her hand on the doorframe, and looked back at him with an expression Julian had never once seen on her face in 9 years of marriage. Not anger, not heartbreak. Something colder and more exhausted than either. My heart is failing, Julian. Dr. Wren says if I don't manage the stress, if anything goes wrong with the delivery, I could die having this baby. So when I tell you no guards, no force, no decisions without me, I'm not punishing you. I'm trying to survive you. There's a difference, and I need you to understand it before you decide to stay. The door closed behind her softly, and Julian Voss stood alone on the porch in the rolling Maine fog, his hands finally still at his sides, staring at a closed door that represented the first thing in his entire life he could not simply buy, threaten, or force his way through. Behind him, down the street, a black sedan he didn't recognize pulled slowly past the diner, slowed at the corner, and idled there for 3 full seconds before continuing on. A car with Massachusetts plates, in a town 4 hours from Boston, where nobody who belonged there had any reason to be driving something that clean. Julian watched it disappear around the bend, and the cold that moved through his chest had nothing to do with the fog rolling in off the harbor. The black sedan didn't come back that night, but Julian didn't sleep anyway. He sat in a motel room 2 miles out on Route 1, the kind of place with a wall-mounted television bolted in place and a bedspread that smelled like someone else's cigarettes. And he ran Massachusetts plates through Reyes at 1 in the morning like a man checking for a pulse. "Run it again," Julian said, the phone pressed hard against his ear, his jaw tight enough to ache. "I ran it twice, boss. Plates registered to a logistics company out of Revere. Shell. Goes nowhere clean." Reyes' voice carried the particular fatigue of a man used to bad news at bad hours. "Could be nothing. Tourist season's not for months, but people do drive up that coast. Nobody drives that road slow past a diner and idles at a corner for no reason." Julian stood at the window, watching a fog roll across the empty parking lot. His reflection ghosted faint against the glass. "Find out who owns that shell, today." "You said no guards, Julian." Reyes' voice carried a warning Julian didn't want to hear. "You said no men in that town. If I start digging on Revere Logistics companies, that's not staying invisible. That's announcing we're paying attention. I don't care what it announces. I care if someone's watching my wife. Your wife who told you not to bring anyone." Julian closed his eyes. Find out who owns the shell, Reyes, quietly. That's not a guard. That's information. He hung up before Reyes could argue the distinction, because Julian already knew there wasn't one. Not really. And some old, cold part of him, the part that had built an empire by never once trusting a coincidence, didn't care. The next morning, Clara's rules became a physical thing Julian had to learn to live inside of, the way you learn to live inside a smaller house. He drove the 2 miles into town at 8, like he'd been told, and waited outside the diner at a wooden picnic table instead of going in, because Clara said she wasn't ready to eat with him watching her eat, said it would feel like being evaluated, and Julian, who had evaluated thousands of people across boardroom tables without a second thought, understood for the first time what it felt like to be on the other side of that kind of looking. She came out at 9:15 with a paper cup of decaf and sat across from him without asking if she could, which told him something about whose table this actually was. You look like you didn't sleep, Clara said. I didn't. Good. Welcome to the last 6 weeks of my life. She said it without venom, just flat exhaustion, the kind that had burned past anger into something more like fact reporting. I want to talk about logistics, not us, logistics. Okay? Dr. Wren wants me near a real hospital starting at 34 weeks. That's 11 days from now. There's nothing here that can handle what might happen if my heart does what it's threatening to do. The nearest facility that can manage both a high-risk delivery and cardiac complications is in Portland, an hour and 10 minutes south on a good day, longer if the coast road floods, which it does this time of year. Clara wrapped both hands around the paper cup like she needed the warmth more than the coffee. I need someone to arrange transport and a place to stay near the hospital, and I need it to be done without me having to make 40 phone calls I don't have the energy for. It is mutual, but that's... I'll handle it. You'll handle it with my approval at every step. Her eyes came up sharp. Not your decision, Julian. My decision with your resources. There's a difference, and I need you to actually hold on to that difference, because the version of you I married doesn't ask. He decides and then informs people. I'm not him anymore. You were him 3 days ago at a gala in front of 200 people. Clara's voice didn't rise, but it cut clean. 3 days, Julian. You don't get to tell me who you are now. You get to show me slowly, and I get to decide if I believe it. Julian sat with that, his hands flat on the splintered wood of the picnic table, and made himself say the thing instead of swallowing it. You're right. Clara studied him like the agreement itself was suspicious. That's new. A lot is new. He looked at her. Really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look in months, maybe years, too busy looking at phones and ledgers and men who wanted things from him. The exhaustion under her eyes had a grayish cast to it that scared him more than anything Reyes could have told him about Revere shell companies. Clara, I want to ask you something, and I need you not to hear it as me trying to control anything. I just need to know it for myself. What? Are you in pain right now? Today? This morning? Clara was quiet for a second too long, which was its own answer. Some days more than others. Today's a 4 out of 10. Wren has a scale. I hate the scale, but I use it because it's the only language he understands that isn't, I'm fine, which apparently I say too often for a woman whose heart muscle is failing. What does a worse day feel like? Like someone sitting on my chest while I try to climb stairs. She said it plainly, the practiced flatness of someone who'd had to describe her own potential dying to enough strangers that the horror of the words had worn down into procedure. Like my pulse doesn't know it's supposed to slow down after I stop moving. Like I black out at the edges of my vision if I stand up too fast. It's been a 6 or 7, twice. Both times Ruth made me sit with my feet up and made Marin come check on me, because apparently in this town, the sheriff also does wellness checks on pregnant strangers who washed up needing a place to stay. Julian's hand curled into a fist on the table without his permission. The old reflex, find the threat, eliminate the threat. Except the threat here was inside her own body, was biology, was something no amount of money or fear could threaten into submission. He felt for the first time in his adult life completely and totally powerless, and the feeling made his skin crawl. I want to fly a cardiologist up here just to consult with Wren, not to replace him, to support him. A second opinion on the transport timeline. Clara considered it, turning the coffee cup slowly between her palms. You ask Wren first, not me. You go find him. You ask him if he wants a consult. And if he says yes, then you ask me who, not the other way around. You don't go around the people I trust to get to me faster. Understood. And Julian, she caught his eyes and held them. If I find out you sent anyone, to look into Ren or Ruth or Marin, background checks, financials, anything like that, we're done. I mean, actually done. Not a fight, not a cooling off period. Done. Julian thought about Reyes, about the sedan, about the call he'd made an hour before sunrise. The lie came easier than he wanted it to. I haven't looked into anyone here. It wasn't entirely a lie. He hadn't looked into Ren or Ruth or Marin. He'd looked into a license plate that had idled outside the diner where his pregnant wife was hiding from him. And some part of him, the part still keeping score, still running threat assessments out of 15 years of habit, believed there was a difference. Clara, if she'd known, would not have agreed. 3 days passed in that rhythm. Julian learned the shape of Clara's new life, the way you learn a foreign country. Slowly, by getting things wrong first. He learned that Ruth Bell didn't like him standing near the register because it made customers nervous, so he sat in the back booth and didn't talk to anyone. He learned that Marin Cole watched him from across the street more often than she let on, her cruiser idling on Main like a sentence she hadn't finished. He learned that Elias Wren, when Julian finally met him properly, was a soft-spoken man in his 50s with a limp from a boating accident 20 years back, and that the doctor's quiet, immovable calm was somehow more intimidating than any of Julian's lawyers had ever managed to be. She's not as stable as she's letting on, Wren told Julian on the 4th day. The two of them standing on the porch of the converted house that served as his office, Clara inside getting an echocardiogram. I don't say that to alarm you. I say it because somebody needs to be making decisions with clear eyes, and I'm not convinced that's possible if everyone around her keeps pretending this is going to resolve itself. What does resolve itself look like if it doesn't? Wren took his time answering, the way men who'd spent decades delivering bad news in small towns learned to take their time. Her ejection fraction is down to 30%. A healthy heart's pumping somewhere around 60. At 30, the heart's working roughly twice as hard to do half the job. Pregnancy makes that worse every week. More blood volume, more strain. If we're lucky, delivery relieves some of that pressure and her heart starts to recover postpartum, which happens in a fair number of peripartum cardiomyopathy cases. If we're not lucky, Wren paused, looked out at the fog still clinging low over the rooftops even at midday. If we're not lucky, the stress of labor itself could push her into full heart failure. That's why I want her near Portland for the last stretch. Not because I doubt myself, because I'm one doctor in a converted house with an EKG machine from 2006, and she needs more than that if things go sideways. Julian's chest felt like something was sitting on it too, a faint echo of what Clara had described. What can I do? You can stop hovering like a man waiting to be allowed back into a building. Wren's eyes were not unkind, but they didn't soften the words either. She doesn't need you fixing things right now. She needs you steady. There's a difference, Mr. Voss, and from what I understand about your reputation, it might be the hardest thing you've ever had to learn. That night, Reyes called with the answer Julian had been waiting 4 days for, and it broke something loose in his chest that he'd been holding very carefully in place. The shell company traces back through 2 more shells, but I got a name eventually. Reyes's voice had the particular tightness of a man delivering news he knew his boss wasn't going to like. Marcus Rain. Julian went very still in the motel room, the phone pressed hard enough against his ear to hurt. Say that again. Marcus Rain. The same Rennie who was standing next to you at the gala when Mrs. Voss tried to talk to you. He's had eyes on that town for at least 5 days, boss. Maybe longer. He was at the gala. Julian's mind moved fast now, the old machinery clicking back online, sorting facts into threats with a speed that felt almost like relief after 4 days of feeling nothing but helpless. He heard everything. He heard her say she wasn't well. He heard me. Julian stopped himself before he said it again. The sentence that had started all of this, the sentence he could not unspeak no matter how many times he replayed that night trying to find the version where he'd said something else, anything else. Boss, Rainey's been circling the territory you're pulling back from for 2 years. He's not subtle about wanting what you've got. If he's got people watching Haven Point, my guess is he's not after Mrs. Voss specifically. He's after leverage. A pregnant wife hiding from her husband in a town with no real security is about as much leverage as a man like Rane could ask for. Julian's hand went white-knuckled around the phone. Pull whoever's watching her quietly. I don't care what it costs. You said no guards in that town. This isn't a guard. This is removing a threat she doesn't know exists. Julian was already pulling on his coat, already moving toward the door, the old version of himself surging back up through the cracks Clara had spent 4 days carefully wedging open. Find out who's actually on the ground there. Tonight, Julian. Reyes rarely used his first name. It was a tell, a flag Julian had taught him to raise only when something mattered enough to break protocol. If you go full offense on this, if you bring in muscle, even quiet muscle, and Clara finds out, you lose her. You understand that, right? You said it yourself. No guards, no force. You break that rule to protect her from a threat she doesn't know is real, and the second she learns the truth, she's going to hear it as you lying to her again. Doesn't matter that your reasons were good. Julian stopped at the door, his hand on the frame, breathing hard in the dark of the cheap motel room. The fight inside him wasn't new. It was the same fight that had been running underneath his whole life. The fight between the man who controlled everything because control kept people safe, and the truth, slower and harder to swallow. That control was exactly what had pushed Clara 4 hours north in the first place. Find out who's watching her, Julian said finally, quieter now. Don't move on them, just find out. I need to know what we're dealing with before I decide what to do about it. That I can do. Julian hung up and stood in the dark for a long time, his own reflection faint in the black window glass. A man caught exactly between two versions of himself with nothing solid to stand on in the gap. The fight with Clara happened 2 days later, and it happened because of something small, the way the worst fights always do. Not because the small thing mattered, but because it was the first crack wide enough for everything underneath to come pouring through. Julian had arranged, with Wren's blessing and what he believed was Clara's full knowledge, for a private medical transport service to be on standby starting at the 34-week mark. A specialized ambulance with cardiac monitoring equipment, on call, parked discreetly at the edge of town so it wouldn't draw attention. He'd told Wren. He'd told Marin, because the sheriff needed to know about any vehicle stationed in her jurisdiction. He had not, in the rush of arranging it, specifically told Clara the transport had already arrived and was sitting 2 streets over. She found out from Ruth, who mentioned it offhand while pouring coffee, assuming Clara already knew. Clara did not already know. She walked out of the diner and found Julian at the picnic table going through paperwork on his laptop, and the look on her face stopped him cold before she'd said a single word. There's an ambulance parked behind the hardware store. Her voice was very quiet, which Julian had learned by now was far more dangerous than loud. Cardiac monitoring equipment. On call since this morning, apparently. Ruth thought I knew. I was going to tell you tonight. You were going to tell me. Clara's hands were shaking, and not from her heart this time. Julian, we had one rule. 1. No decisions without me. And you parked a medical vehicle in my town without telling me it existed. I told Wren, I told Marin, you thought telling the people around me was the same as telling me. Her breath was coming faster now, short, and Julian watched her press her palm flat against her sternum, an automatic gesture, and felt his whole body go cold with fear that had nothing to do with Marcus Rain. Do you hear yourself? That's exactly it, Julian. That's the whole marriage in one sentence. You inform the people around me about my own life, and you think that counts as including me. Clara, sit down, your heart. Don't tell me to sit down like you're not the reason it's racing right now. She didn't sit. She stood there, breathing hard, one hand on the table for balance. And Julian had never in his life felt so useless, so completely unable to fix something with the only tools he'd ever had. Money, force, command. You promised me no decisions without me. You promised me on Dr. Wren's porch 4 days ago, and you broke it in 4 days. I didn't think arranging transport counted as a decision about the baby. Everything counts. Her voice cracked up an octave, sharp enough that 2 fishermen on the sidewalk turned to look, and Clara caught herself, breathing hard, visibly fighting her own body for control. When she spoke again, it was lower, but it shook with something worse than anger, something like grief. Everything counts, Julian, because that's what trust actually is. It's not the big things. Anybody can get the big things right when people are watching. It's whether I can believe you when nobody's watching. And you just told me, 4 days in, that I can't. I was trying to protect you. From what? Clara's eyes locked on his, and Julian felt the question land somewhere dangerous, somewhere close to the truth about Marcus Rain that he had decided, somewhere in the last 2 days, not to tell her. What exactly are you protecting me from, Julian? That required an ambulance with cardiac equipment to show up 11 days early without anyone asking me first? The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Julian made the choice that would define everything that came after. The choice between the truth, which would terrify her at a moment when terror could genuinely kill her, and a lie, which would buy time. He told himself he needed to actually neutralize the threat before she ever had to know it existed. Your condition, Julian said. Ren said things could move fast. I wanted to be ready. It wasn't entirely a lie. That was how Julian had always justified the worst of himself. Find the version of the truth that technically wasn't false, and stand behind it like a wall. Clara studied his face for a long moment, and something in her eyes told him she didn't fully believe him, that some old, well-earned instinct in her recognized the shape of a man hiding something, even when she couldn't name what. Move the ambulance somewhere I can see it, she said finally, her breathing starting to even out. Not hidden behind a building like it's a secret. If it's there because of my heart, fine. But nothing gets parked in my town that I don't know about. Nothing. Are we clear? We're clear. She turned and walked back toward the diner, slower than usual, one hand still pressed to her chest, and Julian sat at the picnic table with his laptop open in front of him and didn't see a single word on the screen, because all he could see was Marcus Ronnie's smile at the gala, 3 seconds before everything in Julian's life had started coming apart. He called Reyes that night and gave him an order he knew, even as he gave it, violated the entire spirit of every promise he'd made on that porch. I want to know what Rain wants, Julian said. Not surveillance. I want someone close enough to find out his actual play. Is this leverage for the territory negotiations, or is this something else? You're talking about putting someone inside Ronnie's operation. I'm talking about finding out if my wife and daughter are in danger before it's too late to do anything about it. Julian's voice had the flat, final quality Reyes had learned over a decade meant the conversation was over before it started. Find me someone. I don't care what it costs. Reyes was quiet for a moment. You know, if Clara finds out about this, there's no coming back from it. Not after the ambulance thing. I know. And you're doing it anyway. Julian looked out the motel window at the dark coastline, the lighthouse beam sweeping slow and steady across black water, and thought about a sonogram photo with 3 words underneath it that he carried folded in his jacket pocket now, every single day, like a wound he refused to let close. I'm doing it anyway. 4 days later, the threat Julian had been chasing in the dark finally introduced itself in daylight, and it did so in the cruelest way Marcus Rain could have chosen. It arrived by courier, a plain brown package addressed simply to Clara, delivered to the diner's front counter on a gray Tuesday morning, while Clara sat in the back booth with a cup of weak tea and a crossword puzzle Ruth had handed her to keep her mind off the ache in her lower back. Ruth brought it back herself, frowning at the lack of return address, and set it on the table. This came for you, no name on the sender. Clara opened it slowly, the way you open anything when your body has learned, recently and painfully, that nothing in your life arrives without consequence anymore. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, sat a silver baby rattle, antique-looking, expensive, wrapped tight in a length of black ribbon tied in a precise, deliberate bow. There was no note. There didn't need to be one. Clara's hands went cold around the box. Ruth, watching her face change, called Marin before Clara had even managed to say a word. Julian arrived 11 minutes later, having broken every speed limit on the coast road, and found Clara sitting white-faced in the booth with Marin beside her, and the rattle sitting on the table between them like something radioactive. What is that? Julian said, though some old instinctual part of him already knew exactly what it was. Had seen exactly this kind of message delivered before, years ago, in a different context, against different enemies, always meaning the same thing. I can reach what you love. Remember that. It's a threat, Marin said flatly. Against your daughter. I don't know who sent it, but I know enough to know it's not a coincidence. And I know enough to know you're going to tell me right now what you haven't been telling me, Mr. Voss. Julian looked at Clara. Clara was staring at the rattle with an expression Julian had never seen on her face before, Not fear exactly. Something colder. Something closer to the look of a woman doing math she didn't want the answer to. Marcus Rain, Julian said quietly. Clara's head came up slowly. What? He's been watching the town. I found out 5 days ago. I should have told you. 5 days? Clara's voice came out thin, stretched. You knew there was a threat against our daughter for 5 days and you didn't tell me. I was trying to handle it before you had to know it existed. You were lying to me! Her voice broke up sharp, and Marin put a steady hand on her shoulder, murmuring something low about breathing, but Clara shook it off. Her eyes locked on Julian with an intensity that scared him more than any boardroom confrontation ever had. The ambulance. That's why the ambulance showed up early. You told me it was my heart. You let me believe my own body was the only reason, and the whole time you knew there was a man out there who might hurt our daughter. And you decided, again, Julian, you decided that I didn't get to know. I was trying to protect. Stop saying that word. Clara's hand slammed flat on the table, the rattle jumping, and the whole diner went silent around them. Protect. You don't get to use that word anymore. Protecting me means I get to know what I'm being protected from. What you've been doing is controlling the information so you could keep being the man with all the answers, the man who decides what I can handle, and that is exactly what put me in a town 4 hours from home in the first place. Julian felt something in his chest crack wide open, old certainties splitting under pressure that had been building for 9 years and finally, in this moment, found nowhere left to go. You're right. His voice came out rough, stripped down to something he didn't recognize. I did it again. I told myself it was different this time because the stakes were higher, but it's the same thing. I keep deciding what you can carry instead of letting you decide for yourself. Then what are you going to do about it? Clara was breathing hard now, one hand pressed against her chest, and Marin was watching her vitals with the focused attention of someone trained to recognize when a conversation needed to end before a body gave out. Because I can't keep doing this, Julian. I came here so my heart could survive long enough to meet my daughter. I did not come here to keep discovering every few days a new thing you decided I didn't need to know. Julian looked at the rattle on the table, at the black ribbon, at the cold, deliberate cruelty of a message sent by a man Julian had built half his criminal empire alongside. A man who knew exactly which buttons to press because he'd watched Julian press the same ones on other people for 15 years. And something in Julian Voss, looking at that rattle, finally understood with total clarity what his life had actually cost. Not in money, not in power, but in the currency that mattered. The only currency Clara had ever actually wanted from him. I'm going to end it, Julian said. All of it. The territory, the men like Rain, the entire structure my father built and I inherited, and you've been paying for with your own heartbeat for 9 years without me ever once noticing. His voice was steady now, stripped of every performance he'd ever used in a boardroom, raw in a way that made Marin glance away, like she was witnessing something too private for a witness. I'm not telling you this to win points, Clara. I'm telling you because it's the only thing left I know how to give you that isn't another promise I might break. Clara stared at him for a long moment, her breathing slowly evening out, the color coming back into her face by degrees. Do you understand what that means? Dismantling that kind of empire doesn't happen quietly, Julian. Men like Ron don't let men like you just walk away. You'll have made yourself weak in front of every enemy you've ever had at the exact moment your family needs you strongest. I know. And you're going to do it anyway. Julian looked at the rattle one more time, then back at his wife. I'm going to do it anyway. That night, Julian drove back to Boston for the first time in 8 days. And the meeting he walked into would close every door behind him that he had ever known how to open. Vivienne Voss received him in the study of the family's North Shore estate, the same room where Julian's father had once explained, with the same cold patience, exactly what kind of man a Voss was required to be. Vivienne sat in the leather chair by the fire, a glass of wine untouched on the side table, her posture perfect. Her face arranged into the particular calm she used when she already suspected she was about to lose an argument and had decided to lose it elegantly. I assume you didn't drive 4 hours back from that fishing village to ask about my health, Vivienne said. I'm dismantling it. The whole structure. The territory deals, the protection arrangements. The contracts Dad built that you've spent 30 years protecting like they were scripture. Julian stood in the center of the room, refusing the chair she gestured toward, needing to stay on his feet for this. I'm starting with the harbor contracts next week. Legal's already drafting the documents to begin formal dissolution. Vivian didn't move, but something behind her eyes went very still, very cold. You're destroying everything your father built. My father built a throne room full of ghosts, Mother. I'm not raising my daughter in it. Your daughter? Vivian's voice carried a particular kind of contempt, the kind reserved for ideas she'd decided were beneath serious consideration. A child who isn't even born yet, and you're prepared to hand the entire family legacy to Marcus Rain and every other vulture circling this territory on the chance that this gesture wins back a woman who already walked out on you once. This isn't about winning her back, isn't it? No. Julian's voice came out harder than he intended, harder than he'd ever spoken to his mother in his life. This is about a silver rattle wrapped in black ribbon that arrived at my wife's door this morning, sent by a man who learned everything he needed to know about her vulnerability, because you and I built a world where information like that becomes a weapon. This is about the fact that I have spent 15 years building something I was so proud of that I let my own wife nearly die rather than interrupt a single phone call. I'm not doing this to win her back, Mother. I'm doing it because I finally understand what it cost to build it in the first place, and I am done paying that price with the people I'm supposed to love. Vivian stood slowly, smoothing her skirt with a precision that did nothing to hide the tremor underneath it. You'll lose everything. The board will turn on you within a month. Rain will move into the territory before the ink dries on your dissolution papers. Every man who ever feared the Voss name will smell weakness and come collect on every grudge you've ever earned. And when it's all gone, the money, the protection, the respect you've spent your whole life building, you'll be standing in some fishing village with nothing left to offer that woman except an apology. And apologies, Julian, have never been worth anything in this family. Maybe that's the point. Julian's voice had gone very quiet now, very final. Maybe an apology with nothing behind it, but the truth is worth more than anything I've ever bought her with this family's money. He turned to leave. Vivian's voice followed him to the door, sharp enough to land even at his back. You'll come crawling back to this house within the year, Julian. Men like you don't survive without power. It's in your blood. Your father couldn't walk away from it, and neither will you. Julian stopped in the doorway, his hand on the frame, and looked back at his mother one final time. My father died alone in a hospital room with a security detail outside the door and not one person inside it who actually loved him. If that's what's in my blood, Mother, I'd rather bleed it out completely than pass it down to my daughter. He left the estate that night and didn't look back at the house in the rearview mirror. Didn't stop at the gates the way he always had out of some old, unexamined habit of respect. He drove straight through the dark toward Maine, 4 hours of empty highway, and his own reflection ghosted faint against the windshield. And somewhere around the New Hampshire border, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer it. Something made him. Mr. Voss. The voice was unfamiliar, smooth, almost friendly, which was somehow worse than if it had been threatening outright. Marcus Rain, I think it's time we talked man to man, don't you? Before this gets any further out of hand than it already has. Julian's hands tightened on the wheel, the dark coast road unspooling ahead of him toward the only thing left in the world he actually cared about protecting. Talk. Not on the phone. I think you and I both know that's not how this conversation should happen. I'll be in touch about a time and a place. Soon. A pause, deliberate, theatrical. And Julian, that ambulance you've got parked behind the hardware store? Smart move. Won't help, but smart move. The line went dead. Julian sat with the phone still pressed to his ear, the empty dial tone humming against his skull, and understood with total, sickening clarity that Marcus Rain had eyes inside Haven Point, close enough to know about an ambulance parked behind a building 2 streets off Main, which meant whatever Reyes had found, whatever quiet surveillance Julian had ordered 5 days ago to keep his family safe, hadn't been quiet enough, or hadn't been enough at all. He pressed the gas down harder into the dark, the coastline rushing past unseen on either side of him, and somewhere behind him in Boston, the empire he'd spent 15 years building had already started, irreversibly, to come apart. While somewhere ahead of him in a small fishing town wrapped in fog, a storm system was beginning to gather over the Atlantic that no amount of money, power, or desperate love would be able to stop from arriving exactly on schedule. Julian didn't sleep that night either. He pulled into Haven Point at 4 in the morning with Rain's voice still rattling around in his skull. "That ambulance you've got parked behind the hardware store, smart move, won't help," and sat in the dark outside the motel with his hands locked white-knuckled on the wheel, running the same question over and over until it wore a groove in him. Someone had told Rain about the ambulance, someone close enough to know where it was parked, close enough to know it existed at all, because Julian had only told 3 people, and none of them should have had any reason to talk to Marcus Rain. He called Reyes at 4:30, not caring about the hour anymore, not caring about anything except the cold certainty crawling up his spine. "Who knew about the ambulance?" Julian said, before Reyes had even finished saying hello. "What?" "The medical transport. Who knew it was parked behind the hardware store? Give me names, Reyes, right now." A pause on the line, the particular silence of a man choosing his words. "You, me, Ren, Marin Cole, the driver, and the EMT, but they're contracted through a service that doesn't know whose wife they're watching, just a confidential medical case. That's it. That's everyone." Rain knew. Julian's voice came out flat, dangerous. "He called me on the drive up. He knew exactly where it was parked. Not that I had transport standing by. Where it was parked. That's not a guess, Reyes. That's somebody talking." The silence on the other end of the line stretched half a second too long, and Julian, who had spent 15 years learning to read the gaps between words better than the words themselves, felt something go cold and still in his chest. "Reyes." "I need to check something," Reyes said, too fast, too careful. "I'll call you back. You'll tell me right now." "Julian, I need to verify before right now." Julian's voice cracked across the line like a closing door. "You've worked for me a decade. You don't get to verify when I'm asking you a direct question about my wife's safety. Tell me what you know." The pause this time lasted 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Julian felt the floor of his entire understanding of the last week shift under him, slow and grinding, like tectonic plates. "There's a man on the surveillance team," Reyes said finally, his voice gone low, almost ashamed. "Dom Pruitt. He's been with me on field work for 2 years, solid record. I put him on watching Rainey's people in Haven Point because he knows the coastline, grew up around Rockland." "What about him?" "He's also worked contract security for Ronnie's organization, years back, before he came to us." Reyes' breath came audible through the phone, the sound of a man hearing his own mistake out loud for the first time. "I knew that when I hired him. I figured old loyalty doesn't mean current loyalty, and his work for us was clean for 2 years, so I didn't think, Julian, I should have flagged it the second I assigned him to this job. I didn't think it through. I was moving fast because you wanted it quiet and quick." Julian closed his eyes, his forehead resting against the cold glass of the motel window. "You put a man with ties to Marcus Rain on the team watching my pregnant wife. I made a mistake. You made my wife's location, my wife's medical timeline, the exact placement of her emergency transport, available to the one man on Earth who wants to use all of it against me." Julian's voice had dropped to something quieter than shouting, which was somehow worse. A register Reyes had only heard a handful of times in 10 years, always right before something in Julian's world ended badly for somebody. "How long has Pruitt had eyes on her?" "Since the day after you sent me looking. 5 days, maybe 6. 6 days. Julian's hand came up against the window glass, flat, pressing hard enough that his knuckles went white. 6 days of him watching my wife, reporting back to a man who sent a baby rattle wrapped in black ribbon to her door, and you're telling me now, not when you assigned him, not when the rattle showed up. Now, because I forced it out of you at 4:30 in the morning. I'm telling you the second I confirmed it. You should have confirmed it before you put him on the job." Reyes didn't argue, because there wasn't an argument that fixed what had already happened. "What do you want me to do?" "Pull him. Now. Tonight." Julian's voice had gone hard and flat, the old cadence of command settling back over him like a coat he'd tried to take off, and discovered he still knew exactly how to wear. "And then I want everything he sent to Rain in the last 6 days. Everything. I want to know exactly how much damage you've handed our enemy." He hung up before Reyes could respond, and stood in the dark motel room with his pulse hammering in his ears. The particular fury of a man who had spent his whole life building systems to prevent exactly this kind of failure, watching one slip through anyway because he'd been too desperate, too distracted, too in love, and too afraid to vet the people he'd trusted with the only thing that mattered. He didn't tell Clara that morning. He told himself it was because there was nothing actionable yet, nothing she could do with the information except be more afraid, and some old reflex in him, the same reflex that had hidden the ambulance, the same reflex that had buried Marcus Rain's name for 5 days, argued that protecting her meant managing what she knew. He recognized the thought even as he had it, recognized it as exactly the failure mode that had cost him everything once already, and told himself this time was different. This time he just needed a few hours to fix it before she ever had to carry the weight of it. He was wrong, and the universe did not wait long to show him how wrong. Clara found out at noon, not from Julian, but from Marin Cole, who'd run her own check on the black sedan that had been idling around town for over a week, and come up with a name that made her blood go cold enough to walk straight into the diner and sit Clara down at the back booth without preamble. "I need you to listen to me carefully," Marin said, her voice low, controlled, a cop's voice delivering news she'd delivered too many times before to soften it. "There's been a man watching this town, parked at the edge of the harbor road, sometimes near the hardware store, sometimes near here. I ran the plate 3 days ago and didn't think much of it. Rental, registered out of state, common enough this time of year. But this morning I pulled his face off the gas station security camera and ran it through state records. His name's Dominic Pruitt. He's got a security contractor history that includes 2 years working for an outfit registered to Marcus Rain." Clara went very still, one hand drifting instinctively to her stomach. "Marcus Rain is the man who sent the rattle." "That's what your husband told me, yes." "And this man, Pruitt, he's been here for 6 days. Clara's voice had gone thin, careful, the sound of someone doing math she already knew the answer to and dreading the confirmation. "Julian knew about Rain 5 days before he told me about the rattle. Did he know about this man too?" Marin's silence answered before her words did. "I called Reyes this morning to confirm the name. He told me Julian found out about Pruitt overnight, said Julian was furious, said he was handling it." Clara closed her eyes. When she opened them, something in her face had gone past anger into a colder, more dangerous territory. The particular stillness of a woman whose worst fear about her own husband had just been confirmed for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. "He knew this morning," Clara said quietly, "and he let me sit here all day not knowing." Don't. She stood up too fast, one hand braced on the table, breathing hard, and Marin reached for her automatically, the instinct of someone who'd watched this woman's body fail under stress before. Clara waved her off, breathing through it, forcing her pulse down through sheer stubborn will. "I'm fine. I need to find my husband." She found him at the picnic table outside, his laptop open, 3 phones lined up beside it like instruments of a war. Clara was only now realizing had been running the entire time without her knowledge. He looked up at her approach, and something in his face shifted immediately, the particular flinch of a man caught mid-sentence in a lie he hadn't finished telling yet. "Clara, how long have you known about Pruitt?" Her voice was perfectly level, which scared him more than shouting would have. Julian's jaw worked once before he answered. "Since 4:30 this morning. 8 hours. Clara's hands were shaking now, not from her heart this time, or not only from her heart. 8 hours, Julian, while I sat in that diner doing a crossword puzzle, completely unaware that a man connected to the person who threatened our daughter has been parked at the edge of this town for 6 days, watching us, watching me. And you decided, again, that I didn't get to know. I was trying to handle it before—" "Stop!" Clara's voice cracked across the open air, sharp enough that 2 men working on a boat trailer down the street looked up. "Stop saying that sentence. You don't get to say, 'I was trying to handle it' one more time in this conversation. I have heard that sentence from you about the gala, about your mother, about the ambulance, about Marcus Rain, and now about this. It's not a reason anymore, Julian. It's a pattern. You think handling it before I know about it is the same as protecting me, and it is not. It's the same thing you did at the gala. It's the same thing you've done our entire marriage. You decide what version of the truth I'm strong enough to carry, and you are always, always wrong about how strong I actually am. I know I was wrong. You said that yesterday, about the ambulance. You stood right here and told me you understood. And then this morning you found out a man connected to Rain had been surveilling this town for 6 days, and you let me have breakfast not knowing. Claire's breath was coming in short, sharp pulls now, and Julian stood, reaching for her, and she stepped back from his hands like they might burn her. Don't touch me right now. Clara, please, your heart. You don't get to use my heart as a reason to stop me from being angry at you. Tears had started somewhere in the last 30 seconds, hot and furious, tracking down a face gone pale with exhaustion and fury, both at once. You don't get to weaponize my own condition to make me hold still, while you keep doing the exact thing that put me in this condition in the first place. Julian stood frozen, hands half raised, every instinct in him screaming to do something, fix something, and finding, for the second time in 2 weeks, that there was nothing to do but stand there and absorb it. I trusted you, Clara said, quieter now. And somehow the quiet was worse than the shouting had been. I let you back into my life 4 days after I left, against every piece of advice Ruth gave me, against my own better judgment, because you stood on that porch and told me you'd finally understood what obedience meant. And every single time since then, when it actually mattered, you've decided you knew better than my own rules for my own safety. I was trying to protect you from being afraid. I'm already afraid, Julian. The words tore out of her, raw, and she pressed both hands flat against her sternum, breathing hard, fighting visibly for control her body wasn't giving her. I have been afraid every single day since the diagnosis. You don't get to decide I shouldn't be more afraid by hiding things from me. All you're doing is making sure that when the fear does arrive, and it always arrives, Julian, it always catches up. It arrives without warning, without preparation, in the worst possible moment, because you spent days managing my access to the truth instead of letting me prepare for it. The diner door opened behind them. Ruth stood in the frame, dish towel still in hand, watching with the particular helpless concern of someone who'd grown protective of a stranger in the space of 2 weeks. Marin came around the corner of the building at a near jog, having clearly heard the raised voices from inside. Clara, you need to sit down, Marin said, her hand going to Clara's elbow. I need my husband to tell me the truth without me having to drag it out of him with a stopwatch. Clara's voice broke on the last word, and that crack, more than anything else, more than the anger, seemed to land on Julian like a physical blow. I'll tell you everything, Julian said, his voice raw. Right now. All of it. Whatever you want to know. It's too late for right now to mean anything. Clara stepped back again, putting distance between them that felt to Julian far wider than the few feet of pavement separating them. Right now should have been 8 hours ago. Right now should have been 5 days ago, when you found out his name the first time. You keep showing up with the truth exactly as late as you can possibly get away with, and I am done, Julian, deciding that's good enough. She turned and walked back into the diner, Marin beside her, Ruth holding the door, and Julian stood alone in the gray afternoon light with his laptop and his 3 phones and the absolute suffocating certainty that he had just watched the ground beneath his second chance crumble under his own feet, one delayed truth at a time. He didn't go after her. Some new, hard-won instinct told him that following her through that door right now would only prove every single thing she'd just accused him of, that he didn't know how to let a closed door stay closed, that he always pushed when he should have waited. He sat back down at the picnic table instead, his hands shaking now too, and put his head in them for a long moment. The first time in 15 years, he'd allowed himself to fully feel the weight of something instead of converting it instantly into the next action item. That was when Reyes called with the rest of it, and the floor Julian thought had already finished collapsing found one more level to drop through. I went through what Pruitt sent Rain, Reyes said, his voice carrying the particular grimness of a man who'd found something worse than he was expecting. It's bad, Julian. He didn't just report the ambulance. He's been sending Rain the whole timeline, Ren's appointment schedule, the 34-week transport plan to Portland, even the route, which roads, which times, which days the coast highway floods, and which stay clear. Julian's blood went cold in a different, more specific way than it had all morning. Why would he need the route? I don't know yet, but I know what it looks like. Reyes paused, and Julian could hear him choosing the next words carefully, the way you choose words you don't want to say out loud. It looks like someone's planning an intercept, not a kidnapping exactly, more like a controlled situation. Get Clara isolated during the transport window when she's most vulnerable, when there's no town full of witnesses around her. Ronnie doesn't need to hurt her to win, Julian. He just needs to be able to prove to you and to everyone watching the territory negotiations that he can reach her whenever he wants. That's the message. That's always been the message. The rattle wasn't a threat to act. It was a demonstration of access. When? Julian was already standing, already moving toward the car, his hands no longer shaking from fear, but from something colder, more focused. When's the transport window? 34 weeks. You said that's 11 days from when you first told me, so 6 days from now. Move it up. Move it up to when? Today. Julian was in the car now, engine turning over, his mind running calculations at a speed it hadn't moved at in 15 years of comfortable, insulated power. I want her in Portland tonight, not waiting for 34 weeks, not waiting for a schedule Rain already knows by heart. Tonight, before he's ready to act on whatever he's planning. Ren needs to sign off on early transport, Julian. You can't just get Ren on the phone, get him to the diner in 10 minutes. I don't care what it takes. He hung up and sat for 1 second in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel, his whole body vibrating with an adrenaline he hadn't felt since the early years building the empire, when every decision still carried real risk and real consequence. Then he saw it. Claire's face from 20 minutes ago, the absolute exhaustion of being told, again, that decisions about her own body and her own safety were being made around her instead of with her. And he forced himself to stop, to breathe, to do the one thing his entire instinct screamed against. He walked into the diner instead of driving away to fix it alone. Clara was sitting in the back booth with Ruth beside her, a damp cloth pressed to the back of her neck, her breathing slow and deliberate, the look of someone working hard to bring her own body back under control. She looked up when Julian approached, and the wariness in her eyes nearly stopped him at the door. "I'm not here to tell you what I've decided," Julian said, staying 3 feet back, hands open at his sides, no laptop, no phone, nothing in his hands but the truth. "I'm here to tell you what I just found out, and then ask you what you want to do about it." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, surprise flickering under the exhaustion. "Go on." Pruitt's been feeding Ron everything, not just the ambulance, your transport route, your appointment schedule, the timing of when you're supposed to move to Portland. Julian kept his voice level, fighting every instinct to soften it, to manage it, to control how much landed at once. "Reyes thinks Ronnie's planning to isolate you during the transport window, not to hurt you, to prove he can reach you whenever he wants, to use you as leverage against me and whatever's coming with the territory." Clara went very pale, her hand finding her stomach automatically. "When?" "The window we planned was 6 days from now. He's had that information the whole time." Julian forced himself to keep going, to not soften the next part either. "I want to move you to Portland tonight, before he's ready. But I'm not deciding that, Clara. I'm telling you what I know, and I'm asking you what you want." For a long moment, Clara said nothing, her eyes moving over his face like she was checking, one more time, for the lie underneath the words. Whatever she found there or didn't find seemed to settle something in her, even as her whole body remained tight with fear. "You're asking me. I'm asking you. That's the first time in 2 weeks." Her voice cracked slightly, not from anger this time, something closer to disbelief. "The actual first time you've come to me with information before you'd already decided what to do with it." "I know." Julian's voice came out rough. "I should have done it every time before this one. I understand if that doesn't fix anything." Clara closed her eyes, breathing through something Julian couldn't name: fear, exhaustion, the particular vertigo of being asked, finally, to make a decision about her own survival after weeks of having it made around her. When she opened them, something had hardened in her gaze, some core of resolve Julian recognized from the woman he'd married 9 years ago, before the silence had worn it down. "Get Ren," Clara said. "If he clears it medically, we go tonight. Not because you decided. Because I decided with the information you should have given me 5 days ago." "Understood." "And Julian." She caught his sleeve as he turned, her grip weaker than he remembered, but no less firm. "This is the last time. I mean that. If there's one more thing you decide to handle before you tell me, one more, I am not staying to find out what comes after that. I will take this baby and disappear somewhere you will never find, no matter how much money you have. Do you understand me?" "I understand." Dr. Wren arrived 9 minutes later, listened to the situation with his characteristic stillness, examined Clara briefly with the EKG machine Julian had once privately thought looked impossibly outdated, and delivered his verdict with the flat, unhurried authority of a man who'd made harder calls than this one in worse conditions. Her vitals are stable enough to travel tonight if we go now, before the stress of waiting compounds anything further, Wren said. But I want to be clear about something, all of you. He looked at Julian specifically. Moving up the timeline because of a threat is the right call, but the storm system building off the coast doesn't care about anybody's timeline. There's a front moving in from the Atlantic, expected to make landfall sometime in the next 48 hours, and if we don't get her to Portland tonight, we may not get a clean window again until it passes. So whatever you're deciding, Mr. Voss, you're deciding it with maybe 6 hours before that road becomes a genuine risk on its own, threat or no threat. Julian felt the walls of the trap closing from two directions at once. Marcus Rain on one side, the Atlantic on the other, and Clara's failing heart caught directly in the middle of both. Then we go now. The transport vehicle pulled up to the diner at 6 that evening, the cardiac monitoring equipment visible through the open back doors this time. Nothing hidden, nothing Clara hadn't approved herself. Ruth hugged her hard at the door, murmuring something Julian didn't catch, and Marin walked alongside the gurney to the vehicle with one hand resting protectively near her holster, scanning the street the entire way. Julian rode in the front, not the back, because Clara had asked for that too. Wanted Wren beside her during the drive, not him. Wanted the only voice near her to be the doctor's calm, practiced reassurance instead of her husband's anxious hovering. Julian accepted it without argument, because arguing was exactly the instinct he was trying, with everything he had left, to finally unlearn. They were 20 minutes outside Haven Point, the coast road narrow and dark, fog rolling thick off the water on both sides, when the driver's radio crackled with a voice that wasn't dispatch. Mr. Voss. Marcus Rain's voice, smooth and unhurried, somehow patched directly into a frequency that should have been secure. I did warn you a conversation was coming. I just didn't expect you'd make me have it on the move. Julian's whole body went rigid in the passenger seat. How are you on this channel? The same way I knew about the ambulance, Julian. I've had better access to your operation than you'd like to believe, for longer than you'd like to believe. A pause, and somewhere in the background of the transmission, Julian could hear what sounded like a second vehicle's engine. There's a checkpoint up ahead. Nothing dramatic. I just want 5 minutes of your time, face to face, before this road gets any harder to drive. I think you'll find it's in everyone's interest to hear me out before you do something rash. In the back of the vehicle, Clara's voice came through thin but clear, picking up on the tension even without hearing the radio directly. Julian, what's happening? Julian looked out at the fog ahead, thick enough now that the headlights barely cut 10 feet into it, the black water somewhere beyond the guardrail, invisible and close, and felt the entire architecture of every careful promise he'd made on Dr. Wren's porch collapse under the weight of a choice with no good version left inside it. Pull over for a man who had already proven he could reach his wife from 100 miles away, or keep driving straight into a storm-darkened road where Ranny's checkpoint might already be waiting around the next blind curve, with Claire's heart and their daughter's life, riding on whichever wrong choice he made in the next 60 seconds. Julian, what's happening? Clara's voice again, sharper now, the gurney straps creaking as she tried to push herself up despite Wren's hand pressing gently on her shoulder, telling her to stay down, stay still. Julian didn't answer her yet. He keyed the radio handset with a hand that wasn't shaking anymore. Strange how the fear had burned off the second the choice became real, the way it always had in the old days, the calm that lived on the other side of panic. Where? Quarter-mile ahead, where the road bends toward the water, Wren's voice crackled back, unhurried, almost pleasant. Just me. No theatrics, Julian. I want to talk, that's all. You pull that ambulance past me without stopping, I won't chase it. I'm not insane, but you and I both know this conversation happens tonight, or it happens some night you don't get to choose, and I think you'd rather choose. The line went dead. Julian set the handset down slow, deliberate, and turned to look at the driver, a broad-shouldered EMT named Castillo, who had gone very still behind the wheel, eyes flicking between Julian and the fog ahead. Keep driving, Julian said. Don't slow down past him. Don't stop unless I tell you to stop. Sir, if there's a vehicle blocking there won't be a vehicle blocking it. He wants a conversation, not a wreck. Drive. In the back, Clara's breathing had gone ragged, the cardiac monitor beside her ticking out a rhythm too fast, climbing, the soft electronic beep accelerating in a way that made Ren lean forward fast, 2 fingers at her wrist, his voice low and steady even as his face had gone tight. Clara, I need you breathing slow for me. In through the nose, 4 counts, hold it, let it go. You're working yourself up, and your heart can't carry the extra weight right now, you understand me? Don't tell me to calm down when my husband won't tell me what's happening. Clara's voice cracked through gritted teeth, sweat already beating at her hairline despite the cold night air leaking through the vehicle's seams. Julian, talk to me, now. Julian turned in his seat, looking back at her through the narrow pass-through, and for 1 second let her see exactly what was on his face instead of managing it for her. The fear, the calculation, the old cold readiness he hadn't let surface in 2 weeks. Rennie's ahead. He wants 5 minutes face-to-face. I'm not stopping the vehicle. You keep moving toward Portland, no matter what happens with me. No. Clara's hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the pass-through frame, knuckles white. No, Julian, you don't get to decide that either. This isn't a decision I'm making around you, Clara. This is the one decision in this entire relationship where there isn't time for both of us to vote. His voice came out harder than he meant it, stripped down to something almost pleading underneath the hardness. I am not letting this vehicle stop while you're inside it. That's not me controlling you. That's me finally understanding what protecting you actually means, and it means I get out and you keep driving. The fog thickened ahead, headlights swallowed into a gray wall 10 feet out, and then, exactly where Ron had said, a shape resolved out of the mist. A single black sedan pulled half onto the shoulder, hazards blinking slow and rhythmic. A man's silhouette leaning against the hood with his hands visible, deliberately visible, palms out. Slow down enough that I can get out without breaking my neck, Julian said to Castillo. Then go. Don't wait for me. Don't look back. Get her to Portland. Julian! Claire's voice tore through the cabin, raw, and the monitor beside her spiked harder, the beeping climbing into a register that made Ren's jaw tighten with real alarm now. I love you, Julian said, and didn't wait to see what her face did with that because if he watched her face break, he wasn't sure his legs would carry him out of the vehicle at all. The transport slowed to a crawl. Julian popped the door, stepped out into cold, wet air that hit his lungs like a slap, and the vehicle pulled away behind him into the fog, tires hissing on wet asphalt, taillights shrinking to 2 red points, and then nothing. He was alone on a dark coast road with Marcus Rain. Rain straightened off the hood of his car as Julian approached, and up close he looked exactly like he had at the gala. Expensive coat, easy smile, the particular relaxed posture of a man who had never once in his life felt physically threatened in a negotiation. That had always been Ronnie's whole strategy. Smile while he cut you. You look like hell, Julian. Rain's voice carried genuine, almost friendly amusement. I heard you're tearing the whole operation down. Harbor contracts, protection deals, the works. Word's already moving through the territory. Some of your old partners are calling it a breakdown. Me, I think it's something else. I think it's fear dressed up as conscience. Say what you came to say. Direct. I like that, actually. It's new for you. Ron folded his arms, the smile staying fixed in place. Here's my offer, and I'm only making it once, so listen carefully. You stop the dissolution. You keep the harbor contracts running through the existing structure for another 18 months. Enough time for the territory to transition without chaos. Enough time for men like me to absorb what you're walking away from in an orderly fashion instead of a free-for-all that gets people killed. In exchange, I call off whatever you think I've got planned for your wife, and we both go back to pretending we respect each other. You sent a baby rattle wrapped in black ribbon to a pregnant woman's door. Julian's voice had gone very quiet, very still, the particular stillness that used to make grown men in his employ take a step back without knowing why. You had a man inside my surveillance team feeding you her medical schedule, her transport route, the exact hour she'd be most vulnerable. And you're standing here calling that a negotiating position. I'm calling it leverage, Julian, because that's what it is. And you of all people understand exactly how leverage works because you've used it on better men than me for 15 years. Renee's smile finally thinned, something harder showing underneath it. Don't act offended. You didn't get where you are by playing fair. You got there by knowing exactly which thread to pull on a man to make his whole life unravel. I just found yours faster than you expected. Julian took one step closer, close enough now that he could see the fine tremor in Rene's jaw, the first crack in the easy performance. If you ever come near my wife or my daughter again, not a message, not a threat, not a man parked on a road watching her, I will burn down every single thing you've built with the same hands that built mine, and I will do it without the courtesy of an 18-month transition. You understand me? That's not how this works, Julian, and we both— Julian moved before he'd finished deciding to, the old reflex surging up through 15 years of careful restraint, his hand closing in the front of Rain's coat and slamming him back hard against the sedan's hood, metal groaning under the impact, Rain's breath leaving him in one sharp grunt. Julian's face was inches from his now, breath fogging hot between them in the cold, wet air. Every promise he'd made on Dr. Wren's porch about restraint, about control, about being a different man, burning off like fog under sun. It works exactly how I say it works tonight, Julian said, his voice low and shaking with something that wasn't fear anymore. Because tonight, you threatened a woman who has maybe a 30% chance her heart survives giving birth to my daughter, and you did it for leverage, like she's a line item, so no. You don't get 18 months, you don't get a transition, you get exactly what's left of the Voss organization's patience, which as of right now is nothing. Rain's hands had come up, not fighting, just bracing, his expensive coat bunched in Julian's fist, and something flickered behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, but recalculation, the look of a man realizing the variables had shifted underneath him. You put your hands on me. You've just handed every enemy you've got a reason to move on you tonight instead of waiting. Is that really the play, Julian? Right now, while your wife's heart is doing whatever it's doing in the back of an ambulance 4 miles up that road? The words landed exactly where Rain intended them to land. A knife slid in clean between Julian's ribs, and Julian felt his own fury catch against something colder and more urgent. Clara, the monitor's rising beep, the look on her face when he told her to keep driving. He released Rain's coat slowly, stepping back, his hands still curled into fists at his sides, breathing hard in the fog. You're right, Julian said low. I don't have time for you tonight. Smart. Rain straightened his coat, his composure sliding back into place like a mask refitted, though his hands weren't quite steady doing it. 18 months, Julian. Think about it. I'll be in touch. There's nothing to think about. The dissolution proceeds. Julian was already backing toward the road, scanning the fog for any sign of headlights, any way to close the distance to Clara faster than his own legs could carry him. And if one more thing happens to my family, Rain, one more rattle, one more man watching from a parked car, one more phone call patched into a frequency that should be secure, I will stop being a man trying to walk away from this life and start being the man who built it. You don't want that version of me. Nobody does. That's why you've spent 2 years circling instead of moving directly. He turned and ran, not toward Ronnie's sedan but down the dark shoulder of the road itself, his dress shoes slipping on wet gravel, lungs burning in the cold, salt air, his phone already at his ear, calling Castillo, calling Wren, calling anyone who could tell him Clara was still breathing. It rang 4 times before Wren picked up, and in the half-second of dead air before the doctor's voice came through, Julian's whole body went cold with a fear bigger than anything Marcus Rain had ever managed to put in him. Julian. Wren's voice was tight, controlled in the particular way of a man working hard to keep panic out of it. Her heart rate spiked to 140 when you got out of the vehicle. It's come down some, but it's not stable. We're maybe 8 minutes from the Portland City line. I need you to understand that if it doesn't stabilize by the time we reach the hospital, we may be looking at emergency delivery regardless of gestational age. I'm running. I'll catch up. You're 4 miles back on foot in the fog, Julian. You are not catching up to a moving vehicle. Wren's voice cut through, sharp with the kind of clarity that came from a man who didn't have time to manage Julian's feelings on top of everything else. Get to a road, flag down anything with wheels, and head for Portland General. I'll have someone meet you at the entrance. Right now I need to focus on your wife, not coordinate your transportation. The line went dead. Julian stood on the dark shoulder of the coast road, fog rolling thick around him, the sound of his own ragged breathing the only thing in the world, and for one suspended second felt something close to the edge of breaking entirely. 15 years of control, of always having a lever to pull, and now nothing. Nothing but his own 2 legs and 4 miles of dark highway between him and the only thing that had ever actually mattered. He started running. A pickup truck found him a mile and a half later, an old fisherman named Garrett Holm, who'd been heading home from the bar in Rockland and nearly hit Julian where he stood in the middle of the fogged-out road, waving both arms over his head like a man flagging down a rescue. Julian didn't explain. He just said, "Portland General, I'll pay you anything." And something about the look on his face, raw, stripped down past pride, past performance, made the old fisherman just nod and unlock the passenger door without a single question. The drive took 11 minutes that felt like 11 years. Julian's leg bouncing, his hands pressed flat against his knees to keep them from shaking. The radio in the truck's cab playing some late-night call-in show about high school basketball scores that Julian heard without hearing. Every cell in his body fixed on the headlights cutting through fog ahead, on the hospital's distant glow. Finally rising on the horizon like something out of a dream, he was terrified might dissolve before he reached it. Portland General's emergency entrance came up fast and bright, fluorescent light spilling out across wet pavement, and Julian was out of the truck before it had fully stopped, throwing a fold of cash at Garrett Holm without counting it, sprinting through automatic doors into air that smelled like antiseptic and fear. A nurse caught him at the desk, already expecting him, Wren's call having clearly gone ahead. "Mr. Voss, your wife's in pre-op. They're prepping for an emergency C-section. Her cardiac status didn't stabilize on the drive in." "Where?" Julian's voice came out wrecked, barely his own. "Where is she?" "Sir, you can't go back there right now. Where is she?" The nurse, reading something in his face that made arguing feel pointless, pointed down a corridor toward a set of double doors marked surgical, and Julian was moving before she'd finished the gesture, his dress shoes slapping wet prints across the polished floor. 2 security guards converging on him from either side as he hit the doors and they didn't open, locked, a keypad beside them blinking red. "Sir, you need to wait in the family area. This is a sterile—" "That's my wife in there." Julian's hands came up against the door, flat, desperate, every ounce of control he'd spent 2 weeks rebuilding burning away into raw animal panic. "That's my daughter. I need to know if they're alive." "Someone will come find you the second there's news, sir, but you cannot be back there right now. It's not safe for the patient or the surgical team." Julian's hands curled into fists against the cold metal door, his forehead dropping forward to rest against it, the fluorescent hallway light buzzing overhead. His whole body shaking now with an exhaustion that went past muscle and into something closer to the soul. He thought about the gala, about the words "too soft for the life I lead," about a wedding ring on a pillow and a sonogram with 3 words underneath it that he still carried folded soft and worn in his jacket pocket. He thought about Rain's hand bracing against his own chest, about the fury he'd felt holding a man against a car hood while his wife's heart spiked 4 miles away. He thought about every single choice across the last 2 weeks where he'd decided, again and again, that he knew better than Clara what she could carry, and understood, with total and devastating clarity, standing alone against a locked door with his wife somewhere on the other side fighting for both their lives, that none of it had mattered. Not the dissolution of the empire, not the confrontation with Rain, not the running, the desperate 4 miles through fog. All of it had led here, to a locked door he could not force open with money or fear or sheer will, the one door in his entire life that didn't care who Julian Voss was. A security guard's hand settled on his shoulder, not rough, almost gentle. "There's a waiting room 2 doors down, sir. Chairs, coffee, someone will come to get you." Julian let himself be guided there, his legs barely cooperating, and sank into a hard plastic chair under buzzing fluorescent light, his hands hanging loose between his knees, his whole body trembling now with cold and adrenaline crash, and a fear so total it had stopped feeling like an emotion and started feeling like a physical fact, like gravity, like something his body simply had to carry whether it wanted to or not. 40 minutes passed. He didn't move. He didn't check his phone, didn't call Reyes, didn't think about Marcus Rain or the territory or anything that had filled his mind completely 2 hours ago. He sat with his eyes fixed on the double doors at the end of the corridor, willing them to open, bargaining silently with a universe he had never once in his life asked anything of, because asking had always felt like weakness, And tonight, weakness was the only thing he had left to offer. At the 53-minute mark, the doors opened and a surgeon in scrubs still damp at the collar walked toward him with a clipboard against her chest and an expression Julian could not read, and his entire body went rigid in the chair, every muscle locked, his breath caught somewhere behind his sternum, waiting. "Mr. Voss." The surgeon stopped a few feet from him, and Julian rose so fast the plastic chair clattered backward against the wall. "Your daughter is alive, 5 pounds, 2 ounces, which is remarkable for 33 weeks. She's in the NICU on respiratory support, but her vitals are strong. She's a fighter." Julian's knees nearly went out from under him, one hand finding the wall to keep himself upright. "Clara, my wife." The surgeon's expression didn't shift the way Julian had braced for, but it didn't fully relax either, and that narrow space between the two was where Julian's heart seemed to stop entirely. "She survived the delivery. I won't pretend it was clean. Her heart went into a brief arrhythmia during the procedure. We managed it. She's stable now, but barely. She's in the ICU, sedated, on cardiac monitoring. The next 48 hours are going to tell us whether this is the start of recovery or the start of something worse. I need you to understand that before you see her. She doesn't look like herself right now. The machines, the tubes. It's a lot, even for people who've prepared for it. I don't care what it looks like. I need to see her. You'll see her in a few minutes. I need you to be calm when you do, for her sake. Her body needs quiet right now more than anything else." The surgeon studied his face a moment longer, some flicker of professional sympathy breaking through the clinical distance. "She asked about the baby before she went under. That was the last thing she said, not about herself, about the baby." Julian closed his eyes, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 2 weeks, for longer than 2 weeks, maybe for 15 years, finally cracked open. And he stood in that fluorescent hallway and wept without trying to hide it, without performing restraint for anyone watching, for the first time since he was a boy. They let him see the baby first because Clara was still in recovery, still too unstable for visitors beyond the medical team monitoring her. A nurse walked him through the NICU's hand-washing protocol with patient, practiced calm, and then led him to an incubator at the end of a row of incubators, each one holding some small, fierce fight for life. And there she was, his daughter. Impossibly small, her skin still thin and faintly translucent at the temples, a CPAP mask strapped gently over her tiny nose, wires taped to her chest tracking a heartbeat that flickered fast and strong across a monitor screen. Julian stood over the incubator with both hands pressed flat against the warm plastic, not touching her yet. A nurse had explained he could, carefully, through the access ports, but his hands wouldn't move, frozen somewhere between terror and a love so total it felt like it might split him open from the inside. "She came out fighting," the nurse said quietly beside him. "Pulled her own breathing tube twice in the first 10 minutes. Strong girl." Julian let out something that was half a laugh, half a sob, watching his daughter's tiny chest rise and fall under the soft hospital light. "Her mother does that too, fights everything, even the people trying to help her." He stayed there a long time, simply watching her breathe, until a different nurse came to tell him Clara was being moved to the ICU and he could see her, briefly, if he kept it short. Clara looked smaller in the hospital bed than Julian had ever seen her look, smaller than the woman who'd stood on Dr. Wren's porch and laid out rules with a spine of iron, smaller than the woman who'd slammed her hand on a diner table and told him to stop saying I was trying to handle it. Tubes ran from the back of her hand. A clip glowed red on one finger. The monitor beside the bed tracked a heartbeat that still moved too fast, even sedated, even resting. Julian pulled a chair close to the bed but did not reach for her hand. He remembered, even now, even shattered open with relief and terror both, the rule that had governed every single day of the last 2 weeks. No decisions without her, not even this one. He sat. He waited. He watched her chest rise and fall, slower now than the monitor's frantic numbers from an hour ago, and somewhere around 3 in the morning. With the hospital gone quiet around him except for the soft electronic chorus of machines keeping people alive in every room down the hall, he let his head drop forward against the edge of the mattress. Not sleeping exactly, just resting, just present, the only thing he had left to offer her. Clara woke for the first time near dawn, her eyes fluttering open, slow and unfocused, the fluorescent hospital light harsh after whatever darkness sedation had carried her through. Julian sat up immediately, every cell in his body snapping awake. But he didn't move toward her, didn't reach for her hand, didn't do anything except hold himself very still and let her find him with her own eyes first. "Julian?" Her voice came out cracked, dry, barely a whisper. "I'm here." Clara's eyes moved past him, around the unfamiliar room, the IV line, the monitor, before coming back to his face. And the question that came out of her was the only question that had ever actually mattered. "The baby. She's alive." Julian's voice broke on the word, and he didn't fight it this time. 5 pounds, 2 ounces. She's in the NICU on a little bit of breathing support, but the doctors say she's strong. She pulled her own breathing tube out twice in the first 10 minutes, Clara, already giving everybody trouble. Something moved across Clara's exhausted face. Not quite a smile, but close. The first real softening Julian had seen in 2 weeks. "That sounds about right." "You scared me," Julian said quietly. "Your heart went into arrhythmia during the surgery. They told me it could have gone either way. But it didn't." Clara's hand moved slightly on the blanket, not quite reaching for him, but not pulling away either, an opening Julian recognized for exactly what it was. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a door left unlocked instead of bolted shut. "I'm still here. You're still here." Julian reached out, slow, giving her every chance to stop him, and rested his hand near hers on the blanket without closing the distance fully, leaving the choice to her the way he'd promised, the way he'd finally learned to. Clara looked at his hand for a long moment, then turned hers over, palm up, and let her fingers settle lightly against his. It wasn't everything. Julian understood that even in the relief of the moment, it was the first inch of a road that was going to be long and slow and full of days when she still wouldn't trust him, still wouldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth without watching to see if his actions matched them. But it was something. It was a door, opened a crack, by a woman who had every reason in the world to keep it sealed forever. "What do we name her?" Clara whispered. "Whatever you want. I'm not deciding that without you. I'm not deciding anything without you ever again." Clara's eyes filled, exhaustion and emotion blurring together, and she said the name slow, like she was testing the weight of it in her mouth before she gave it to the world. Hope. Hope Elise Voss. Because she came when everything was breaking, and she made it anyway. "Hope," Julian repeated, and felt the words settle into his chest like something permanent, like a foundation poured under a house that had nearly collapsed. Hope Elise Voss. The days that followed moved slow in the particular way hospital days always do, measured in vital sign checks and small incremental victories instead of hours. Clara's cardiac function began, cautiously, to improve. The ejection fraction climbing back from 30% towards something closer to recoverable, the particular relief Dr. Wren had described on his porch weeks ago, the body sometimes healing once the strain of carrying new life had been relieved. Hope grew stronger by the day, gaining ounces, breathing more and more on her own, her tiny fierce grip closing around Julian's finger the first time he was allowed to hold her properly. Skin to skin, his bare chest against her impossibly small body, and Julian wept again, openly, in an NICU chair surrounded by nurses who had clearly seen this particular kind of breaking before and knew enough to simply let it happen without comment. Marcus Rain did not come to Portland. Whatever calculation he'd run after the confrontation on the coast road, whatever cost-benefit he'd weighed against a man who'd put his hands on him in fury and meant every word of the threat that followed, he stayed away. And 3 weeks later, Reyes called with news that Rain had quietly pulled his people out of the territory negotiation entirely, redirecting his ambitions toward a different rival's holdings further south. It wasn't peace, not exactly. It was the particular silence that exists between two predators who've both decided the other isn't worth the cost of the fight. At least not today, not over this. Julian didn't know if it would last forever. He'd stopped needing things to last forever. He'd started needing them to last long enough. Vivienne Voss did not call, and Julian did not call her. The dissolution of the territory holdings proceeded through the slow, grinding mechanism of lawyers and filings and quiet meetings with men who'd once feared the Voss name and now simply looked tired, looking at Julian across conference tables like he was a problem they were relieved to see resolving itself. Some called it weakness, the way Vivienne had predicted. Julian found he no longer cared what they called it. He'd stopped measuring his life by what men in conference rooms thought of him, Somewhere around the moment, he stood outside a locked surgical door with nothing to offer the universe except his own desperate, wordless bargaining. 3 weeks after Hope's birth, strong enough now to leave the NICU, the family, Julian, Clara, and a daughter small enough still to fit along Julian's forearm, drove north out of Portland, back up the coast road, fog rolling soft and low over gray water, back toward Haven Point. Ruth Bell met them at the diner door with her arms already open. No pretense of the suspicion she'd shown Julian on his first day in town, and folded Clara into a hug careful of the healing incision, murmuring something about how she'd just known, that baby girl was going to be a fighter from the second the rattle showed up and Clara's chin had gone up instead of down. Maren Cole stood on the sidewalk with her arms crossed and something almost like approval in her flat cop's eyes, watching Julian carry his daughter through the diner's door without a single guard, without a single phone in his hand, without a single piece of the man who'd first walked into this town 9 weeks earlier still visible on the surface. "You look different," Maren said, falling into step beside him as he settled Clara into a booth. "I am different. We'll see." Maren's mouth twitched, almost a smile. The closest thing to warmth Julian had gotten from her since the day she'd threatened to make every legal and illegal problem he'd ever caused look like a parking ticket. "Town's got a long memory, Mr. Voss. You stick around, you keep showing up the way you've been showing up. Maybe that changes what people remember about your first morning here." Julian did stick around, not immediately permanently. There were still loose ends in Boston, still court filings and security transitions, and a board that needed to be formally dissolved into something smaller, cleaner, legal. In every sense, Julian had never bothered making his business legal in before. But he made the 4-hour drive every week without fail, sometimes twice a week, sleeping at the motel on Route 1 until the night Clara told him, quietly, over coffee at the diner with Hope sleeping against her chest, that the room above the diner had a second bedroom Ruth wasn't using, if he wanted it, just until he found something more permanent in town. It wasn't an invitation back into her bed. Clara was careful, in the months that followed, to keep that distinction clear, and Julian respected it with a discipline that surprised even him. Sleeping in the second bedroom, learning the particular shape of fatherhood at 3 in the morning when Hope cried and he was the one who got up, learning to make formula with shaking hands the first dozen times, learning to fix Ruth's ancient, temperamental espresso machine because it gave him something to do with his hands that wasn't running an empire, learning slowly, painfully, what it looked like to be useful instead of powerful. A year passed. The Voss territorial holdings, the harbor contracts, the protection arrangements his father had built, and Vivian had spent 30 years defending, dissolved fully into legitimate shipping interests managed by a board that had no idea and no need to know what the company's foundations had once been built on. Some of it came apart through Julian's own filings. Some of it came apart through investigations he didn't fight, evidence he didn't bury. Men who'd once worked for him now facing consequences. Julian had spent 15 years insulating them from, because the truth, once he'd started telling it, proved harder to stop than he'd expected, and he found he didn't actually want to stop it. Vivian remained on the periphery of all of it, untouched by prosecution but utterly exiled from her son's life, a woman who had built her entire identity around being indispensable to a Voss empire that no longer existed in any form she recognized. Julian heard, secondhand through lawyers, that she'd moved to a smaller property on the Cape, that she rarely left it. He didn't reach out. Some doors, once closed for the right reasons, were meant to stay closed. Julian attended therapy every Thursday in Portland, a fact that would have been unthinkable to the man who'd stood in that gala ballroom a year earlier, dismissing his pregnant wife's fear as softness. He sat across from a quiet, unimpressed therapist named Dr. Okafor, who didn't care about his net worth or his reputation, who asked him instead, week after week, to sit with the specific discomfort of every moment he'd chosen silence over his wife, control over trust, and to actually feel what that cost, instead of converting the feeling instantly into the next decisive action. It was, Julian told Clara once, the hardest work he'd ever done, harder than building an empire, because an empire could be built with willpower alone. And this slow unlearning of every instinct that had made him who he was, required something closer to surrender, a word Julian had spent his whole life treating as synonymous with weakness. He learned slowly that it wasn't, By Hope's first birthday, Julian Voss had become a fixture in Haven Point that the town no longer regarded with suspicion, the quiet man who fixed Ruth's espresso machine on Tuesday mornings, who walked the harbor road every evening with his daughter strapped against his chest, who'd shown up week after week, month after month, without a single broken promise, until the town's long memory had slowly, grudgingly, begun rewriting its first impression of him into something closer to respect. Clara still wore her wedding ring, but not on her finger. It hung now on a thin silver chain around her neck, resting against her sternum, close to the heart that had nearly stopped twice in the space of a single year, and had, against every projected odds Dr. Wren had laid out on his porch that first week, recovered enough that her cardiologist in Portland had recently used the word remarkable in a chart note Julian had glimpsed over her shoulder. The ring on the chain wasn't a rejection. Clara had explained it to him once on a cold evening on the harbor road, in the particular plain-spoken way she'd never lost even in the months when her trust in him had been at its thinnest. "It's not back on my finger because I'm not pretending nothing happened, Julian. It's on this chain because it's close enough to feel every single day, and far enough that I get to decide every single day whether it goes back on. That's not punishment, that's just honesty. I'd rather give you something true than something performed." Julian had nodded, understanding it the way he'd learned to understand most things from her now. Not as rejection, but as the slow, deliberate architecture of rebuilding something that could actually hold weight this time, instead of looking sturdy from the outside while rotting through underneath, the way his entire life before Haven Point had looked sturdy and had rotted through underneath for 15 years without him ever once noticing. One evening in late spring, almost exactly a year to the day since Clara had walked out of a glittering ballroom with her chin held high and her heart already failing in ways neither of them yet understood, Julian and Clara walked the harbor road together as the sun dropped low and orange over the water, Hope asleep against Julian's chest in a soft carrier, her small fist curled loose against the fabric, her breathing slow and even, and entirely unremarkable in the way that only parents who have once feared losing a child can fully appreciate. They didn't talk for the first stretch of the walk, comfortable now in a silence that had taken a year to earn. Not the old silence, the kind Julian used to retreat into when business mattered more than presence, but a different silence, the kind two people share when neither one needs to fill the air to prove anything to the other. "Do you miss it?" Clara asked eventually, her eyes on the water, gold light scattering across the harbor's small ripples. "The power, Boston, all of it." Julian considered the question honestly, the way he'd learned to consider every question Clara asked him now, instead of reaching for the answer that sounded best. "No," he said finally. "I don't miss the power. I miss—" He paused, searching for the precise truth instead of the comfortable one. "I miss who I might have been if I'd chosen this sooner. If I'd chosen you, chosen presence, chosen the harder thing instead of the easier thing. Back when choosing it wouldn't have nearly cost me everything to learn the lesson. I don't grieve the empire, Clara. I grieve the years I spent building it instead of building this." Clara was quiet for a moment, watching a fishing boat cut a slow white line across the harbor toward the horizon, its engine a distant low thrum carried faint on the evening air. Then she reached over and took his hand, not pulled toward him, not desperate, just steady, deliberate, the gesture of a woman who had decided, in her own time, on her own terms, that this particular door could open a little further tonight. Julian didn't pull her closer. He'd learned that much, at least, in the long unraveling of who he used to be. That love, the real kind, the kind that survives the worst version of a person and chooses to stay anyway, doesn't grab. It receives. It holds only what is freely given, and trusts that what is freely given today might be given again tomorrow, and the day after that, slowly, the way the tide pulls back from the shore and always, eventually, comes home again. They stood there a while longer, hand in hand, their daughter sleeping warm against her father's chest, the last gold light of day spreading thin and quiet across Haven Point's small harbor, touching the water, the boats, the weathered shingles of Ruth's diner glowing faint in the distance, touching everything in that small town that had taken in a broken family, and with patience neither Julian nor Clara had any right to expect, slowly, carefully, helped put them back together. The fog would roll in again tomorrow, the way it always did on that coast, And some days would still be harder than others. Claire's heart would still need monitoring for years to come. Julian's old instincts would still occasionally surface and need catching before they did damage. The work of trust, once broken and rebuilt, would never again be finished work, only ongoing work, the daily unglamorous labor of two people choosing each other again and again instead of once and for all. But tonight, standing on that quiet stretch of Harbor Road, with the woman who had once left her wedding ring on his pillow and walked out into the dark rather than stay one more day inside his silence, Julian Voss understood, with a clarity that no empire, no fortune, no fear he had ever commanded in another human being had ever given him, exactly what he had nearly lost, and exactly what it had taken to finally deserve the chance to keep it. The water moved soft and dark beneath the last of the light. Somewhere behind them, the diner's neon sign buzzed faintly to life against the coming dusk, and Clara's hand stayed in his, warm and steady, asking for nothing, offering everything that mattered, while their daughter slept on, safe, against the heartbeat of a man who had finally learned, after losing everything that once defined him, how to simply stay.